March 19, 1945, the air over Lubang Island hung thick with gunpowder and desperation as Second Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda of the Imperial Japanese Army received orders that would reshape his entire existence. Major Yoshimi Tonoguchi stood before the 23-year-old intelligence officer in the Philippine jungle, his words cutting through the humid darkness like a samurai blade. "You are absolutely forbidden to die by your own hand. It may take 3 years, it may take 5, but whatever happens, we'll come back for you." The young lieutenant bowed deeply, his resolve hardening into something unbreakable. He had been trained at the Nakano School, Japan's elite institution for military intelligence and guerrilla warfare, where soldiers learned not just combat tactics, but the psychological fortitude to survive impossible circumstances. Onoda belonged to the Futamata branch, specializing in unconventional warfare behind enemy lines. As American forces tightened their grip on the Philippines, most Japanese soldiers faced a grim choice: surrender or death. Onoda was given a third option: continue the fight, no matter what. Within weeks, Emperor Hirohito's voice crackled across radio waves on August 15, 1945, announcing Japan's surrender. World War II had ended. 6 years of global carnage ceased. Soldiers worldwide laid down their weapons, embraced loved ones, and began rebuilding shattered lives. But deep in Lubang's mountainous jungle, Onoda heard nothing. The war, for him, had just begun its strangest chapter. Initially, Onoda commanded a small group of holdouts. Corporal Tsuchishimada, Private First Class Kinshichi Kazuka, and Private Yuchi Akatsu formed his guerrilla cell. They survived on bananas, coconuts, and stolen livestock from local Filipino farmers. The soldiers constructed elaborate hideouts, moved constantly, and interpreted every aircraft, every search party, every dropped leaflet as enemy psychological warfare. When planes scattered pamphlets announcing Japan's surrender, Onoda examined them with his intelligence training. The typography seemed wrong. The paper quality felt suspicious. These were obvious American tricks designed to lure loyal soldiers into capture. The 4 men established a brutal routine of survival. They rationed resources meticulously, maintained their weapons with religious dedication, and avoided all contact with islanders, whom they regarded as enemy collaborators or American puppets. Historical records from the Philippine National Archives document that local residents reported numerous encounters with these Japanese ghosts throughout the late 1940s, though authorities initially dismissed such claims as folklore. Private Akatsu broke first. After 6 months of isolation, hunger, and psychological strain, he surrendered to Filipino forces in 1939. The remaining 3 intensified their vigilance, certain that Akatsu had been captured and tortured. They viewed his departure not as abandonment, but as confirmation that the enemy was closing in. For Onoda, trained to suspect deception at every turn, surrender remained inconceivable. His commanding officer's final words echoed endlessly. "Whatever happens, we'll come back for you." The jungle became their universa. Green cathedral of survival, where yesterday and tomorrow merged into one eternal mission. The war that ended for billions continued for 3 Japanese soldiers who trusted their orders more than reality itself. October 1950, Toother monsoon rains hammered Lubang Island with relentless fury, turning mountain paths into rivers of mud as Corporal Shimada collapsed near their hidden encampment. Malaria had ravaged his body for weeks, and despite Onoda's desperate attempts to treat him with traditional remedies and stolen medicine, the fever proved insurmountable. Shimada died in the jungle's embrace, leaving only Onoda and Kozuka to continue their phantom war. The 2 remaining soldiers adapted their tactics. They became more cautious, more calculating, more invisible. Local Filipino communities lived in genuine fear of these jungle warriors who materialized like spirits, raiding farms for food and occasionally exchanging gunfire with police patrols. According to a 1958 report from the Manila Times, Philippine authorities organized multiple search operations, deploying hundreds of soldiers and police officers into Lubang's interior. But the trained guerrilla fighters evaded every attempt at contact. The Japanese government, embarrassed by the international attention, sent search parties throughout the 1950s. Family members made the journey to Lubu, broadcasting messages through loudspeakers, pleading for the soldiers to come home. Onoda's own brother traveled to the island in 1952, his voice amplified across the valleys. "Hiroo, the war is over. Mother is waiting. Please come home." Hidden in the foliage, Onoda listened with tears streaming down his face, but his training overrode his heart. This was sophisticated psychological warfare, perhaps using voice recordings or an actor. The Americans had occupied Japan. They could force anyone to say anything. Onoda and Kozuka developed an intricate understanding of the island's rhythms. They knew which farmers left their fields unguarded, which paths patrols typically followed, and how to read weather patterns for optimal movement. They aged in isolation, their uniforms deteriorating into patchwork cloth held together by jungle vines and determination. Their rifles, meticulously maintained with improvised oil from coconuts, remained operational through sheer force of will. The outside world transformed beyond recognition. Japan rose from atomic ashes to become an economic powerhouse. The 1960s brought televisions, bullet trains, and prosperity to a nation that had been devastated. Young Japanese people knew war only through history books and their grandparents' stories. But in Lubang's mountains, time stood frozen in 19... The soldiers interpreted every modern development as wartime propaganda. Commercial aircraft became military reconnaissance. Transistor radios and flashlights found during raids were clearly new American equipment. Tourism infrastructure developing on the island represented enemy fortifications. Their reality became a perfect closed loop, where all evidence contradicting their mission was reinterpreted to confirm it. May 1972 brought catastrophe. During a firefight with a Philippine Army patrol near the village of Luke, Corporal Kozuka fell, struck by return fire. Onoda dragged his friend's body into the jungle, but Kozuka died within hours. The last companion of Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda's 27-year war was gone. At 50 years old, Onoda found himself completely alone on an island that had become his prison and purpose simultaneously. He buried Kozuka according to military tradition, marking the grave with a cairn of stones that no one would find. Now truly solitary, Onoda faced the most dangerous enemy he had ever encountered himself, and the crushing weight of absolute isolation. February 1974, a scruffy 24-year-old Japanese adventurer named Norio Suzuki landed on Lubang Island with a backpack, a camera, and what friends considered an absurd quest. Suzuki had dropped out of college to pursue what he called his 3 impossible goals: find Lieutenant Onoda, find a panda, and find the abominable snowman, in that order. While his friends laughed, Suzuki possessed something previous searchers lacked. He wasn't hunting Onoda as an authority figure or family member demanding surrender. He simply wanted to meet the legendary soldier as one wanderer encountering another. Suzuki approached the search unconventionally rather than organizing armed patrols or broadcasting surrender appeals. He camped alone in the jungle, deliberately making himself visible and vulnerable. He left signs of his presence: a campfire, food offerings, Japanese newspapers, and waited. For days, nothing happened. Then, on February 20th, 1974, Suzuki woke to find a weathered skeletal figure standing at the edge of his campsite, rifle aimed steadily at the young traveler's chest. "I am Second Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda of the Imperial Japanese Army," the figure announced in formal pre-war Japanese. "Identify yourself immediately." What followed was one of history's most surreal conversations. Suzuki, unfazed by the weapon, smiled and bowed respectfully. He explained he wasn't military, wasn't government, just a traveler who had read about Onoda and wanted to meet him. For the first time in decades, someone spoke to Onoda without demanding surrender or claiming the war had ended. They talked throughout the night about Japan, about the world, about the nearly 30 years that had passed. Suzuki showed Onoda newspapers, photographs of modern Tokyo, evidence of Japan's transformation. The lieutenant examined everything with his intelligence officer's scrutiny. The details were too elaborate to fabricate, too consistent across multiple sources. Something shifted in Onoda's understanding, a crack forming in the certainty that had sustained him for 3 decades. But training overrode emotion once again. "I will not surrender," Onoda declared with quiet dignity, "unless I receive direct orders from my commanding officer, Major Taniguchi." Suzuki understood. This wasn't about evidence or logic, it was about honor, duty, and the structure that had kept Onoda alive when everything else had been stripped away. The young wanderer proposed something extraordinary. He would return to Japan. Locate Major Taniguchi and bring him to Lubang to officially relieve Onoda of his command. It seemed impossible Taniguchi might be dead, or impossible to locate after 30 years. But Suzuki had come to Lubang Island seeking the impossible, and he had found it staring back at him through eyes that had witnessed decades of solitary war. They parted as the sun rose, Onoda melting back into jungle shadows, while Suzuki began what would become an international sensation. Upon returning to Tokyo, Suzuki's story exploded across Japanese media. The young adventurer's photographs of the weathered lieutenant appeared in every newspaper, as documented in the March 1974 edition of the Japan Times. The entire nation became transfixed by the soldier who had fought for 3 decades after peace. The Japanese government launched an immediate investigation to locate Major Taniguchi. What they discovered would bring Onoda's war to its final, extraordinary conclusion. March 9, 1974 Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, now 62 years old, and working as a bookseller in a quiet Tokyo neighborhood, received a visit that resurrected ghosts he had tried to forget for 30 years. Government officials stood in his modest shop, explaining that Second Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda remained alive on Lubang Island, still following the orders Taniguchi had delivered in March 1945. The former major, who had long assumed all his subordinates had either surrendered or perished, stood speechless as journalists' cameras flashed around him. Within days, arrangements were made for what would become one of the 20th century's most remarkable military ceremonies. The Japanese government coordinated with Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos, who granted special permission for the operation. Taniguchi would travel to Lubang not as a veteran visiting a historical site, but as a commanding officer delivering orders to a soldier who had never stopped serving. March 10, 1974 helicopters descended onto Lubang Island, carrying Major Taniguchi, government officials, journalists from around the world, and Norio Suzuki, who had orchestrated this impossible reunion. The designated meeting point was a small clearing on the island's mountain slope. Philippine soldiers secured the perimeter, but per Onoda's conditions communicated through Suzuki, they remained at a distance. This would be a military matter between a commanding officer and his subordinate. Onoda emerged from the jungle exactly on time, his sense of military punctuality undiminished by 3 decades of isolation. He wore the remnants of his Imperial Army uniform, patched and repatched countless times, his rifle maintained to parade standards despite its age. His posture remained perfect, his salute crisp and precise. At 52 years old, he looked simultaneously ancient and ageless, a man preserved in amber, while the world around him had transformed beyond recognition. Major Taniguchi stepped forward, and for a long moment the two men simply stared at each other across a chasm of time. Then Taniguchi spoke, his voice carrying the weight of 30 years and untold regret. "Lieutenant Onoda, I am here to relieve you of your duties." The formal ceremony proceeded with military precision. Taniguchi read the official orders. In accordance with the Imperial Command, all combat operations have ceased. You are hereby ordered to cease all military activities and place yourself under the command of the nearest superior officer. The words that should have been delivered in August 1945 finally reached their intended recipient in March 1974. Onoda saluted sharply, tears streaming down his weathered face. "I have carried out my orders to the best of my ability," he reported formally. "I am prepared to present my weapon and account for my actions." He handed over his Arisaka Type 99 rifle, still functional and meticulously maintained, along with his sword ammunition and hand grenades he had preserved for 3 decades. The surrender ceremony concluded, Onoda was technically under arrest. Philippine authorities had documented 30 deaths over the years attributable to the Japanese holdouts, including 2 fishermen killed in 1972. However, President Marcos, recognizing the extraordinary circumstances and eager to strengthen Japan-Philippine relations, issued a full pardon the following day. Onoda had been following military orders in wartime, Marcos declared, even if that wartime had extended 3 decades beyond reality. The journey from Lubang to Manila, then to Tokyo, thrust Onoda into a world utterly alien to the one he had left. Skyscrapers replaced bombed-out buildings. Former enemies were now trading partners. The emperor he had served was the same man, but now a symbolic figurehead of a democratic nation, rather than a divine ruler of an empire. Japan had not only recovered from defeat, it had become one of the world's most prosperous nations. March 24. 1974, Hiroo Onoda stepped off the plane at Tokyo International Airport into a barrage of camera flashes and shouting reporters that felt more overwhelming than any enemy fire he had faced. Thousands of Japanese citizens crowded behind barriers, waving flags and holding signs welcoming him home. The nation was transfixed by this soldier from another era, a living embodiment of pre-war values of duty and loyalty that had been systematically dismantled in post-war Japan's rush toward modernity. But Onoda felt like a ghost walking among the living. The Japan he had left in 1944 no longer existed. The streets of Tokyo, once familiar, now resembled science fiction. Neon advertisements blazed in every direction. Young people with long hair and colorful clothing laughed freely on street corners. Women wore short skirts and spoke their minds openly. Everything his generation had fought to preserve had been voluntarily abandoned in pursuit of Western-style democracy and capitalism. The psychological dislocation was profound. Onoda struggled with basic aspects of modern life: vending machines, automatic doors, television, telephones. Currency had changed. Social customs had transformed. The language itself had evolved, incorporating English words and abandoning formal speech patterns he considered essential. He was 52 years old, but felt centuries out of place, a samurai awakening in an age that no longer valued or understood the code by which he had lived. Media attention became suffocating. Publishers offered enormous sums for his story. Film companies competed for rights to his life. Strangers stopped him on the street, some praising his dedication, others uncomfortable with his reminder of Japan's militaristic past. The government awarded him back pay for his 30 years of service, a substantial sum that meant little to a man who had survived on stolen bananas and coconuts. Onoda published his autobiography, No Surrender, My 30-Year War, in 1974, which became an international bestseller. The book provided his perspective on those decades not as delusion or fanaticism, but as duty fulfilled despite impossible circumstances. Critics debated whether he was a hero, a victim of indoctrination, or a cautionary tale about blind obedience. Onoda himself rejected simple categorization, insisting he had simply been a soldier following orders in a war that, for him, had never officially ended. Within a year, Onoda made a decision that surprised everyone. In 1975, he emigrated to Brazil, purchasing a cattle ranch in Mato Grosso do Sul. Japan, he explained, no longer felt like home. The values he cherished had vanished. But in Brazil's rural interior, among immigrant communities that still honored traditional virtues, he found something resembling the world he understood. Yet Onoda never fully escaped his past. In 1984, he established the Onoda Nature School in Japan, teaching survival skills and self-reliance to young people he felt had grown soft in prosperity. He divided his time between Brazil and Japan, becoming an increasingly complex figure criticized by some as a relic of militarism, celebrated by others as an exemplar of dedication and duty. The deaths on Lubang haunted him. In 1996, now 74 years old, Onoda returned to the Philippines and donated $10,000 to a local school, a gesture of reconciliation for the lives his three-decade war had cost. He met with families of those killed, apologizing while also trying to explain the impossible position he had occupied, a soldier whose war never ended because no one could convince him it had. Hiroo Onoda died on January 16, 2014, at 91 years old in Tokyo. His passing marked the end of World War II's longest casualty, man who had survived the war itself, 3 decades of jungle isolation, and nearly 40 years of trying to make peace with a world that had moved on without him. But his story remains a profound meditation on duty, obedience, and the psychological mechanisms humans employ to survive impossible circumstances. Onoda was neither hero nor villain, neither delusional nor rational, but something more complicated, a soldier who followed orders so completely that he continued fighting long after the battle had ended. The army had dissolved, and the empire he served had transformed into something utterly unrecognizable. But the jungle island of Lubang, where Onoda spent his Phantom War, now attracts tourists who visit the sites where he camped, raided, and survived. Local guides tell stories of the Japanese ghost soldiers to visitors who struggle to comprehend how anyone could remain so isolated from reality for so long. But perhaps the question isn't how Onoda stayed in the jungle for 30 years after World War II ended. Perhaps the real question is how the rest of humanity convinced itself that wars truly end, when for those who fight them, the battles sometimes never stop. They simply move from jungle clearings to the landscapes of memory, where they continue raging until the final soldier finally lays down his weapon and surrenders to the peace he could never quite believe had arrived.